On the morning of October 15th, 1857, the scaffold at Augusta County Jail cast its shadow over a throng of nearly 3,000 onlookers. They had gathered to observe the execution of a man whose revelations had shocked even the most seasoned lawmen in Mississippi. James Copeland, age 34, sat in his cell, meticulously recounting the details of murders so savage that the court's scribe had to pause several times to steady himself. Among the evidence presented at trial were 43 human fingers preserved in brine and stored in a leather satchel that Copeland had carried for over a decade. Each finger narrated a tale of deliberate cruelty along the Pearl River, where entire households had learned to secure their doors at dusk. What turned a respected young farmer into the most dreaded outlaw in the American South remained a mystery until those final confessions unveiled truths that authorities had sought to conceal for years. Before we proceed with the story of James Copeland and the terror that gripped the Pearl River Valley, I want you to know that this channel delivers the most chilling and enigmatic stories from American history. If you're captivated by true crime and historical mysteries, subscribe now and share in the comments what state or city you're tuning in from. Your support helps us unearth these overlooked tales of horror. The path that led James Copeland to the gallows began not with violence, but with a simple act of compassion that would ultimately doom his soul forever. Pearl River County, Mississippi, in the 1840s, was a region where civilization teetered on the edge. Thick cypress swamps extended for miles along the meandering Pearl River, forming a natural divide between cultivated farmlands and the untamed frontier beyond. Spanish moss cloaked the ancient oaks like burial shrouds, and the humid air carried the incessant hum of insects and the occasional splash of an alligator vanishing beneath the murky water. The Copeland family had established their homestead in 1838, when James was just 15 years old. His father, Samuel Copeland, had acquired 200 acres of fertile bottomland from a retiring fur trapper named Etienne Budrow. The property included a modest two-story farmhouse, a barn, and several weathered-out buildings. Samuel Copeland was known throughout the county as an upright man who settled his debts and treated neighbors with respect. His wife, Martha, had died giving birth to James, leaving the boy to be raised by his father and an elderly aunt named Prudence. Young James possessed a rare blend of intellect and physical prowess. He could read and write better than most men twice his age, yet he could also fell a tree or tame a horse with remarkable skill. Neighbors often noted that he had his mother's gentle eyes and his father's strong hands. By 1842, at age 19, James had become one of the most eligible bachelors in the county. Standing 6 feet tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to peer into one's soul, he was a striking figure. The Pearl River served as both lifeline and thoroughfare for the scattered communities along its banks. Steamboats delivered supplies and news from New Orleans, while smaller vessels transported cotton, timber, and other goods downstream to market. The river also drew unsavory characters, gamblers, swindlers, and outlaws who used the labyrinthine swamps as refuges between their crimes. Sheriff Thomas Bullock, a veteran of the Creek Wars, did his best to maintain order, but his jurisdiction spanned over 800 square miles of some of Mississippi's most rugged terrain. In 1843, James Copeland met Elizabeth Hartwell at a harvest festival in Columbia, the county seat. Elizabeth, daughter of Judge William Hartwell, one of southern Mississippi's most esteemed men, possessed a rare beauty with auburn hair and green eyes that radiated intelligence and kindness. More importantly, she showed genuine interest in James despite their differing social standings. Judge Hartwell owned a plantation with over 50 enslaved people and had connections throughout the state government. Their courtship followed the era's customs. James rode the 15 miles to Columbia every Sunday after church, bringing small gifts and spending chaperoned hours with Elizabeth at the Hartwell plantation. The judge initially had reservations about his daughter courting a modest farmer, But James's intelligence and evident devotion gradually won him over. By spring 1844, an engagement announcement was anticipated. The first hint of trouble emerged in April of that year when a merchant named Calvin Richardson vanished while traveling from Hattiesburg to Columbia. Richardson had been carrying nearly $800 in gold coins to purchase land near the Hartwell plantation. His horse was found wandering near the Pearl River, but no trace of Richardson himself was ever found. Sheriff Bullock organized search parties that scoured the swamps for days without success. The incident cast a shadow over the community, reminding everyone of the frontier's dangers. James Copeland seemed particularly affected, joining every search party and spending long hours combing the riverbanks for any sign of the missing merchant. Elizabeth later told investigators that James had grown increasingly moody and distracted during this period, often staring into the distance during their conversations, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. The truth about Calvin Richardson's fate emerged only during James Copeland's final confessions 13 years later, but the events of that April morning in 1844 would forever alter the young farmer's destiny. According to Copeland's own words, spoken in a hushed tone as he sat chained in his death cell, the encounter began as a simple case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Copeland had been checking his fish traps along a remote stretch of the Pearl River, about 5 miles downstream from his father's property. The morning mist still clung to the water when he heard a horse approaching through the cypress trees. Calvin Richardson emerged from the fog, riding a fine chestnut mare and leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. The merchant appeared anxious, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if fearing pursuit. "Good morning, young man," Richardson called out, his voice betraying relief at encountering another person in the wilderness. "I seem to have lost my way. Can you direct me to the Columbia Road?" James pointed upstream toward a barely visible trail winding through the swamp. "Follow the river for about 2 miles, then look for the blazed oak tree on your left. The trail will lead you straight to Columbia." Richardson thanked him and was about to proceed when his horse stumbled, throwing him to the ground with a sickening crack. The merchant's right leg bent unnaturally, clearly broken, and his agonized screams echoed through the swamp, sending birds fleeing from their roosts in the ancient cypress trees. James rushed to assist, his natural instincts overriding other considerations. As he knelt beside the injured man, Richardson grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Please," the merchant gasped, "don't leave me here. There are men following me, dangerous men who want to rob me. They've been tracking me since Hattiesburg." The young farmer faced a terrible dilemma. Richardson's leg required immediate medical attention, but the nearest doctor was in Columbia, hours away through treacherous swamp trails. Leaving the man alone would likely mean his death, either from blood loss or from the mysterious pursuers he claimed were following him. Yet carrying him to safety through the dense undergrowth was nearly impossible. As if summoned by Richardson's fears, the sound of multiple horses crashing through the underbrush reached their ears. James helped the merchant to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they stumbled toward a thicket of palmetto bushes offering concealment. Through the green fronds, they watched 3 rough-looking men emerge from the mist, their eyes scanning the riverbank with predatory intensity. The leader was a massive man with a gray beard and arms like tree trunks. His companions appeared younger but equally menacing, with the lean, hungry look of professional killers. They dismounted and began examining the ground where Richardson's horse had left tracks in the soft earth. "Trail goes cold here," one of them said in a gravelly voice. "Horse likely went into the water." The bearded man shook his head. "Richardson's too clever for that. He's hiding nearby." He raised his voice, addressing the swamp itself. "Come out, merchant. We know you're here. Make this easy, and we'll end you quickly." James felt Richardson's body trembling against his as the 3 outlaws spread out along the riverbank. The merchant's breathing grew shallow and rapid, and blood seeped through his torn trousers from the broken bone. In his delirium, he began to mumble prayers, his voice barely audible but still too loud for their precarious situation. One of the younger outlaws froze, tilting his head like a hunting dog catching a scent. "Hear that, Gideon? Sounds like someone praying." The bearded leader, apparently named Gideon, drew a long knife from his belt, its blade gleaming wickedly in the filtered sunlight. "Richardson, last chance to show yourself. Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Make us hunt you, and we'll take our time." James Copeland faced a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He could remain hidden and watch these men torture and murder an innocent person, or he could reveal himself and almost certainly share Richardson's fate. The merchant's prayers grew louder as his pain intensified, and James knew their hiding place would be discovered within minutes. What happened next, according to Copeland's confession, occurred in a blur of violence that seemed to last an eternity yet was over in seconds. As Gideon and his men closed in, James made his decision. But instead of revealing himself to save Richardson, he pressed his hand firmly over the merchant's mouth, cutting off both prayers and breath. Richardson's eyes widened in terror as he realized what was happening, but his broken leg prevented effective resistance. James held his hand in place until Richardson's struggles ceased, his own heart pounding so loudly he was certain the outlaws would hear it. The merchant's body went limp, and James gently lowered him to the ground behind the palmetto bushes. He had chosen his own survival over the life of an innocent man, a choice that would resonate through every subsequent crime he committed. The outlaws searched for another hour before abandoning their hunt. As their horses' hoof beats faded into the distance, James Copeland found himself alone with Calvin Richardson's corpse and a terrible realization of what he had become. The merchant's lifeless eyes stared accusingly at the cypress canopy above, his mouth frozen in a silent scream of betrayal. But James's ordeal was far from over. As he knelt beside the body, grappling with what he had done, his eyes fell upon the leather saddlebags that had fallen from Richardson's horse during the accident. One had burst open, spilling gold coins across the moss-covered ground. James counted nearly $800, more money than his family would see in 5 years of farming. The sight of that gold triggered something dark in his mind. Richardson was already dead, killed by his own hand to ensure their mutual silence. The merchant had no family in Mississippi, no one who would come looking for him. The three outlaws believed he had escaped, and local authorities would assume he had been murdered by bandits or killed by wild animals in the swamp. If James disposed of the body and kept the gold, no one would ever know what had happened. Yet, even as these thoughts formed, James faced a practical problem. Richardson's body would eventually be discovered, and the broken leg would tell a story inconsistent with death by drowning or animal attack. Moreover, the merchant wore a distinctive gold ring bearing his initials, and his fine, quality clothes would be easily recognized. Any investigation could trace back to the last person seen in the area, James himself. It was then that James Copeland committed his first act of deliberate mutilation. Using Richardson's own knife, he carefully removed the merchant's ring finger to ensure the distinctive jewelry could never be traced to its owner. The act filled him with revulsion, yet he found the process strangely methodical, almost calming in its precision. He wrapped the severed finger in a piece of cloth torn from Richardson's shirt and placed it in his pocket, though he could not explain why he kept it. The rest of Richardson's body went into the river, weighted with stones, and pushed into a deep pool where alligators would dispose of any remaining evidence. James kept the gold, the knife, and that first severed finger. He told himself it was purely practical, a way to ensure his secret remained buried, but deep in his heart he knew something fundamental had shifted within him. The transformation was not immediate. For several weeks after Richardson's death, James continued his routine of farming and courting Elizabeth Hartwell. He used small amounts of the gold to improve his father's property, claiming he had sold cattle to a passing trader. Samuel Copeland was pleased to see his son taking initiative, never suspecting the money was stained with blood. Elizabeth noticed subtle changes in James's behavior, which grew more pronounced as months passed. He became more possessive of her time and attention, less tolerant of other suitors who might call on her. His eyes, once warm and humorous, now held a coldness that unsettled her. When she shared these concerns with her father, Judge Hartwell dismissed them as the natural jealousy of a young man in love. The second murder occurred in September 1844, just 5 months after Richardson's death. This time, the victim was a traveling preacher named Reverend Augustus Fleming, known for carrying substantial donations from his congregations for a new church in Mobile, Alabama. According to Copeland's confession, he had not planned to kill Reverend Fleming. The preacher's death resulted from what James described as an opportunity that presented itself. Fleming had stopped at the Copeland farm to water his horse and share a meal with the family. Samuel Copeland was honored to host a man of God, and the evening passed pleasantly with scripture readings and spiritual discussions. As Fleming prepared to depart the next morning, he made a fatal mistake. He mentioned to James that he was carrying over $400 in donations and asked for directions to the safest route to Mobile. The preacher's trusting nature and obvious wealth rekindled the dark impulses that had led to Richardson's death. James volunteered to guide Fleming through the swamp to the main Mobile road, claiming knowledge of shortcuts that would save hours of travel. Samuel Copeland blessed their journey and watched them disappear into the morning mist, never suspecting that Reverend Fleming would not be seen alive again. The killing took place at a remote crossing where an old logging road met the river. James struck the preacher from behind with a heavy tree branch, then finished him with Richardson's knife while Fleming lay unconscious. This time, the act felt easier, more natural. The revulsion he had felt with Richardson was replaced by a cold efficiency that disturbed him even as he embraced it. Before disposing of Fleming's body, James removed the preacher's right index finger, adding it to the cloth bundle he had carried since Richardson's death. He told himself it was about preventing identification, but the truth was more complex. The fingers had become trophies, physical reminders of his power over life and death. News of Reverend Fleming's disappearance spread rapidly throughout southern Mississippi. Unlike Calvin Richardson, who had few local connections, the preacher was widely known and beloved. Churches across 3 counties organized search parties, and the state government offered a reward for information about his fate. Sheriff Thomas Bullock faced intense pressure to solve the case, particularly from religious leaders demanding justice for their fallen brother. James Copeland joined the searches with apparent enthusiasm, volunteering countless hours to comb the swamps and backroads for any trace of the missing preacher. His dedication impressed everyone, including Elizabeth Hartwell, who praised his selflessness in helping find a man of God. Samuel Copeland beamed with pride at his son's community spirit, unaware that James knew exactly where Reverend Fleming's remains were feeding the catfish in a deep pool of the Pearl River. The investigation took a turn when Bullock discovered that both Richardson and Fleming had been carrying substantial sums of money at the time of their disappearances. The sheriff began to suspect a gang of robbers was targeting wealthy travelers on the river roads. He sent word to authorities in surrounding counties, warning them to be alert for similar crimes. This development worried James more than he cared to admit. 2 disappearances might be coincidence, but a pattern would draw unwanted attention to anyone present during both incidents. He needed to be more cautious, spacing out his activities and choosing victims less likely to be missed. The third murder occurred in December 1844, and this time James had learned from his previous experiences. His victim was a slave trader named Marcus Kellerman, a man whose profession made him widely despised. Kellerman was traveling north from New Orleans with a coffle of 15 enslaved people he planned to sell in Natchez. He had stopped near the Copeland farm to repair a broken wagon wheel. Samuel Copeland was uneasy about Kellerman's presence, but frontier hospitality demanded he offer shelter for the night. The slave trader was a crude, violent man who treated his human cargo with casual cruelty. He boasted drunkenly about the profits he would make in Natchez and displayed a money belt containing over $600 in gold and silver. James watched Kellerman's behavior with growing disgust, but his moral outrage was mixed with a hunger for the man's wealth. When Kellerman announced his intent to depart before dawn to avoid the day's heat, James offered to show him a shortcut through the swamp that would save miles of difficult travel. The killing of Marcus Kellerman was the most brutal yet. James had grown more confident, taking his time with the slave trader, making him suffer for his cruelties before ending his life. He removed Kellerman's right middle finger and added it to his collection, also taking the man's gold teeth, which he pried from the corpse's mouth with pliers. The 15 enslaved people who had witnessed Kellerman's departure with James posed a serious problem. They had seen the young farmer guide their master into the swamp, and their testimony could lead investigators back to the Copeland farm. James addressed this with characteristic ruthlessness, leading the confused and frightened people deeper into the swamp and abandoning them without food, water, or knowledge of the terrain. Most died within days, victims of exposure, wild animals, and the treacherous Mississippi swamplands. 3 reached safety, but were quickly recaptured by slave catchers and sold to new masters in distant states. Their stories of Kellerman's disappearance were dismissed as attempts to avoid punishment for running away. By 1845, James Copeland had killed 6 people and amassed nearly $3,000 in stolen money. His collection of severed fingers had grown to include trophies from each victim, carefully preserved in salt and stored in a leather pouch hidden beneath the floorboards of his room. The methodical mutilations had evolved from practical necessity into a ritualistic obsession. The murders also caught the attention of Gideon McCready, the bearded outlaw leader whose pursuit of Calvin Richardson had indirectly sparked James's first killing. McCready headed a loosely organized gang of thieves and murderers operating throughout the river parishes of Louisiana and Mississippi. He had been following reports of the disappearances with professional interest, recognizing the work of someone who could be useful to his organization. McCready contacted James through carefully arranged meetings designed to test the young farmer's reliability and ruthlessness. The outlaw leader was impressed by James's intelligence and ability to deflect suspicion, but he was particularly intrigued by rumors of mutilation circulating in the criminal underworld. The partnership that developed between Copeland and McCready's gang terrorized the Pearl River Valley for the next 2 years. James provided local knowledge and a legitimate cover for the gang's activities, while McCready offered protection and access to more lucrative targets. The severed fingers became James's signature, a calling card that instilled fear in potential victims and earned him respect among his criminal peers. Elizabeth Hartwell began noticing more troubling changes in her fiancé's behavior during this period. James had formally proposed marriage in spring 1845, and Judge Hartwell had given his blessing. The wedding was planned for October, but Elizabeth grew increasingly uneasy with the man she had agreed to marry. James's eyes had developed a predatory quality, like a cat watching a mouse before pouncing. He spoke less often, but with greater intensity, and his conversations frequently turned to topics of violence and death that seemed inappropriate for a respectable farmer. Most disturbingly, he began collecting knives and other weapons, claiming they were tools for farm work, but displaying them with excessive enthusiasm. The turning point came in August 1845, when James and McCready's gang attacked a riverboat called the Southern Belle as it traveled upstream toward Columbia. The boat carried 12 passengers, including 2 families with young children, and a cargo hold filled with valuable goods bound for inland merchants. The attack was meticulously planned and executed with military precision. James had scouted the boat's schedule and identified the ideal ambush spot, a narrow bend in the river where the current forced the vessel close to shore. Macready's men boarded from both sides, overwhelming the small crew before they could resist. What followed was a massacre that shocked even hardened criminals. The gang systematically robbed and murdered every person aboard, showing no mercy for age or gender. James personally killed 3 passengers, including a young mother traveling to Colombia for her sister's wedding. He removed the woman's ring finger as a trophy, along with her gold wedding band and pearl necklace. The Southern Belle incident marked a turning point in the gang's activities and in James Copeland's psychological descent. The mass murder sparked enormous public outrage and brought federal authorities into the investigation. More importantly, it fulfilled something dark within James's soul, confirming his transformation from reluctant killer to enthusiastic predator. Just when we thought we'd seen the depths of James Copeland's depravity, the horror in Pearl River County intensified. If this story is sending shivers down your spine, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of one man's descent into madness. The discovery of the Southern Belle's burned wreckage 3 days later sent shockwaves through Mississippi. Federal marshals arrived from New Orleans to coordinate the investigation, and the state legislature authorized a special fund for rewards leading to the capture of those responsible. Sheriff Bullock found himself working alongside investigators with resources and expertise far beyond those available in rural Pearl River County. The increased scrutiny forced James to be more cautious in his personal life. He maintained his facade as a devoted fiancé and dutiful son, but the pressure of living a double life was taking its toll. Elizabeth noticed he had begun talking in his sleep, muttering incomprehensible words and sometimes crying out as if in pain. When she asked about these disturbances, he dismissed them as wedding-related stress. Samuel Copeland also observed changes in his son, attributing them to the natural pressures of preparing for marriage and increased responsibility. James had become more withdrawn and irritable, spending long hours away from the farm on supposed business trips to arrange financing for new equipment. Samuel was pleased at his son's initiative, unaware that these absences coincided with additional murders throughout the region. The confession that ultimately sent James Copeland to the gallows began on October 10, 1857, in the death cell of Augusta County Jail. Sheriff William Henderson had been questioning Copeland for weeks, using every interrogation technique learned over 23 years in law enforcement. The outlaw remained stubbornly silent, responding with cold stares or occasional grunts. Henderson had tried everything: appeals to conscience, promises of leniency, even threats of additional charges. But James sat on his narrow cot like a granite statue, his piercing blue eyes revealing nothing. The sheriff was losing hope of learning the full truth when fate provided an unexpected breakthrough. Henderson mentioned that Elizabeth Hartwell, now Elizabeth Camden, after marrying a respected lawyer in Colombia, had agreed to testify about James's strange behavior in the months leading to their broken engagement. The mention of Elizabeth's name cracked something within James. His rigid posture slumped, and his steady hands began to tremble uncontrollably. For the first time since his capture, tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. "Elizabeth," he whispered, the name emerging like a prayer in a forgotten tongue. "Sweet, beautiful Elizabeth, does she know what I became?" Henderson seized the moment, softening his tone to match James's. "She knows you were arrested, James. She knows about the charges, but not the details. Not yet. She could still remember you as the young farmer she once loved if you help us understand what happened to that man." James's voice, when he finally spoke in earnest, was barely audible, forcing Henderson to lean close to the cell bars. The sheriff had prepared with extra paper and ink, but nothing could have readied him for the magnitude of the confessions that poured forth over 3 days. "I loved her," James whispered, gripping the iron bars so tightly his knuckles whitened. Everything I did, every choice in those early days, was to become worthy of her love. I wanted to be more than a farmer scraping by in Mississippi mud. I wanted to give her the life her father's wealth could provide, a life my honest labor could never achieve. The confession spanned 3 days and filled nearly 200 pages of Henderson's careful handwriting. James described 47 murders committed between 1844 and 1856, each recounted with chilling precision. He began with Calvin Richardson, detailing not just the killing but the internal struggle that preceded it. I held my hand over his mouth and felt his life slip away, James said, his voice taking on a dreamy quality. In that moment I discovered something about myself I'd never known. I had the power to decide who lived and who died, and that power was intoxicating beyond any drug or drink. He explained his system of taking fingers as trophies, describing how the practice evolved from necessity into ritual. Initially, it was to prevent identification, but the digits became symbols of dominance. Each finger told a story. He told the horrified sheriff. This one was from a merchant who begged until the end. This one from a preacher who cursed me with his dying breath. This one from a woman who fought like a wildcat to protect her children before I silenced her forever. The most shocking revelation came when James led Henderson and federal marshals to a hidden cave along the Pearl River, where he stored his macabre collection. Located on a small island accessible only during low water, the cave was surrounded by cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, forming a shadowy cathedral. Inside, investigators found the leather case with 43 preserved fingers, along with a trove of evidence painting a complete picture of James's criminal career. He had kept detailed records of each killing, sketches of victims, maps of death sites, and notes on their final words and stolen valuables. The cave also held personal items, jewelry, watches, religious medals, family photographs, as secondary trophies. Most disturbing were journals recording his thoughts and feelings about each murder, analyzing his techniques for improvement. I studied my craft like others study medicine or law, James told Henderson. I read accounts of famous murders, adapting and improving techniques. I experimented with methods to maximize suffering while minimizing discovery. One journal detailed the psychology of his victims, categorizing their reactions to impending death and developing tailored approaches. Federal Marshal Robert Thornberry called the cave a monument to evil, unmatched in his 30 years of law enforcement. James's methodical record-keeping provided a roadmap to dozens of unsolved murders across the Mississippi River Valley, solving cases that had baffled authorities for years. The true horror of James Copeland's crimes went beyond the body count or grotesque trophies. His confession revealed a campaign of terror that traumatized the region for over a decade. Families lived in fear, travelers avoided the Pearl River roads, and communities were transformed by the presence of a hidden monster. The psychological profile from his confession depicted a man who gradually surrendered his humanity for wealth and power, yet retained enough cunning to maintain a respectable facade. He described his evolving killing methods with a craftsman's detachment, showing pride in his efficiency rather than remorse. I became what I needed to be, he told Henderson. Society creates its monsters by offering rewards honest men can't achieve. I had the courage to take what I wanted, unbound by others' limitations. Elizabeth Hartwell Camden's testimony, given privately to spare her public ordeal, provided insight into James's deteriorating mental state during his most active criminal period. She described subtle changes starting before their engagement, which she had attributed to courtship stress. He began speaking differently about people, she testified through tears. Where he once showed compassion for the unfortunate, he expressed contempt for those he deemed weak or foolish. He spoke of the poor as deserving their fate and the wealthy as superior. Elizabeth also shared nightmares that plagued her after ending their engagement, vivid dreams of James as a creature of shadows and blood, whispering her name with the voices of the dead. These visions drove her to consult ministers and a specialist in nervous disorders, but nothing alleviated them. Most damning was her recollection of a summer 1845 conversation, months before she ended their engagement. James spoke of their future wealth and status, and when Elizabeth asked how he'd achieve it so quickly, his chilling smile made her blood run cold. He said opportunities were all around for those bold enough to seize them. She testified, "Successful men take what they want, regardless of the means. I thought he meant business competition, but now I see he was describing a philosophy that led to murder." The trial of James Copeland became a sensation across the South, with newspapers from New Orleans to Charleston providing daily coverage. The courtroom overflowed with spectators, including victims' families and curiosity seekers drawn by the gruesome details. Hotels in Augusta County were booked solid as people traveled hundreds of miles for the trial of the century. Judge Harrison Pembroke, a veteran of Mississippi's notorious criminal trials, called the Copeland case the most disturbing of his career. A dignified man in his 60s, Pembroke was shaken by the evidence. In 40 years on the bench, he told colleagues privately, "I have never encountered such calculated evil. This man destroyed lives not from passion or desperation, but from cold calculation that human beings were obstacles to his ambitions." Defense attorney Robert Sinclair, a young lawyer appointed when no experienced counsel would take the case, argued that James was insane and not responsible for his actions. Sinclair brought alienists from Philadelphia to testify about James's mental condition, presenting theories of moral insanity and inherited criminal tendencies. Dr. Hamilton Breckinridge, a prominent alienist, argued James suffered from constitutional moral deficiency, lacking empathy or guilt despite normal intellect. However, the insanity defense was undermined by the methodical nature of the crimes. The prosecution argued that James's detailed records and planning showed clear awareness of right and wrong, even if he ignored moral constraints. James refused to support the insanity defense, insisting he was fully aware of his actions. "I am not insane," he declared in court. "I made conscious choices based on rational calculations. If that makes me a monster, so be it. Do not diminish my crimes by pretending I was unaware of their consequences." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Charles Waverly, an ambitious politician, built an ironclad case using the finger collection and confessions. Waverly's Our closing argument traced James's transformation from promising farmer to remorseless killer, dismissing insanity claims and highlighting the calculated nature of the crimes. "You have heard evidence of crimes so heinous they challenge our faith in humanity," Waverly concluded. James Copeland chose evil with full knowledge of its consequences. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Foreman Thomas Whitfield called the decision the easiest he'd ever made, citing overwhelming evidence. Judge Pembroke sentenced James to death by hanging on October 15, 1857. James received the sentence calmly, nodding as if it confirmed his expectations. When asked for final words, he addressed the courtroom. "I have received the justice I deserve. I hope my fate warns others tempted to follow my path. No treasure is worth a man's soul." In his final weeks, James worked with Sheriff Henderson to identify additional victims, leading to the recovery of bodies and solving long-standing mysteries. Some saw this as redemption, but Henderson believed James enjoyed reliving his crimes. He described each murder with the enthusiasm of a man recounting great achievements. Henderson wrote, "James led investigators to burial sites across 3 counties, revealing mass graves of entire families. One horrific discovery was near the Louisiana border, where he had buried the Patterson family, 6 members, including 4 children aged 3 to 14. killed for $47 and a pocket watch. Elizabeth Hartwell Camden sent a letter to the jail chaplain expressing forgiveness. The letter, delivered 3 days before the execution, moved James to tears. "I choose to remember the James Copeland who brought me wildflowers," she wrote. "I pray you find that good man before your final judgment." James's dictated response apologized for her pain and asked her to forget him. Samuel Copeland visited twice, struggling to reconcile the son he raised with the killer in the cell. "You did nothing wrong, Father," James told him. "The choices were mine alone." Samuel died within a year, broken by grief. On execution day, nearly 3,000 gathered outside Augusta County Jail. James ate a simple breakfast, refusing a special last meal, and walked to the gallows without a hood, showing no fear. Addressing the crowd, he said, "Let my death warn others. No gold can purchase peace for a conscience stained with blood." The hanging occurred at 11:47 a.m., and James died instantly. His body was buried in an unmarked prison cemetery grave to prevent it becoming a shrine or target. The leather pouch of 43 fingers was burned, and the ashes scattered in the Pearl River. Sheriff Henderson retired 6 months later, moving to California to farm, haunted by the case. The confession notes and trial transcripts, sealed for over 50 years, were released in 1910, shocking criminologists. Dr. Breckenridge's 1,862 study, based on the case, influenced modern forensic psychiatry. The Copeland case spurred regional criminal identification systems and investigative techniques. The Pearl River region healed slowly, but stories of the finger collector persist, with historical markers and the cave attracting dark tourism. The case remains a chilling testament to human evil and law enforcement's pursuit of justice. What do you think of this story? Do you believe James Copeland's confessions revealed the full extent of his crimes, or might there be undiscovered victims? How would modern forensic techniques handle such a case? Share your thoughts below and join us for more chilling true crime stories from America's past. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with a friend who loves mysteries.